Hi, I'm Rex Burks,
And I'm Owen Younger,
and we are the Skeptical Texans.
and we watch Atheist Edge, and so should you.
Okay, it took me a while to understand the difference between a sound argument and a valid argument, but at some point I seem to have gotten the grasp of it. It'll take a lot more practice, but here's where I give Dr. Carrier some examples and ask him to tell me if I'm right. His response: it can be confusing, especially as in colloquial English, the distinction is not commonly made. Even I fail to keep them distinct when speaking or writing off the cuff and don't pay close attention. A valid argument is always true if the premises are true. Ergo, a valid argument can still be false if one of the premises is false. A sound argument, by contrast, is always probably true, because sound means both valid and the premises are probably true. Soundness is thus a statement about the premises and includes declaring the argument also valid, while validity is a statement only about the form of the argument, disregarding at the moment the separate question of whether the premises are even credible. It gets really tricky when you try to disentangle formal from informal fallacies. I get tripped up on that all the time. It's a technical distinction I recommend just avoiding because it rarely matters. A fallacy is a fallacy either way. Then another challenge question later on in the course, Dr. Carrier asks us to choose one point made in this unit's reading from Levitin's Field Guide to Lies that was the most difficult for you to grasp or understand. Whether you did understand it or not, just choose one that you found to be the hardest. Make your best effort to describe what that point is, as much as you could grasp of it, or even what you think but aren't sure was the point Levitin was trying to get across. Then explain what you found difficult about it, or that you didn't understand about it. You can frame this part of your answer as a question or series of questions. This is how I responded. On page 110, I don't understand the usefulness of a probability estimate like this, seeing as there are so many unforeseen extraneous conditions which can affect the outcome. 33% of people who ordered a hamburger also got served ketchup, but 38% of those who didn't order a hamburger got ketchup. Dr. Carrier's response was, he's illustrating what you can deduce from the data given to you to teach the usefulness of probability tables. It's what we call a toy example. It's not meant to be serious, just clear enough that you can understand how the tool is used, and then use it well on other more serious things. Famous example being the mammogram study, where using these tables it was found that taking mammograms too soon and too often causes more harm than it prevents, because of the false positive rate and the damage done on a patient's health by receiving a false positive. Here, he notes that doing this can lead to discovering there may be a practice going on that needs to be looked at more closely. For example, what is ketchup being used for? If you are given hard data showing who received a serving of ketchup and who didn't, which can have a serious purpose, if you are an executive concerned about the efficiency and losses, having data on who is and who isn't being given a serving of ketchup could matter. But what this is for isn't relevant to Levitin's point. He's just using this as a toy example to teach you the tool. You can deduce things that might not have been obvious. You can use this tool to go from the raw data, how many customers did X, to all manner of probabilities. The probability of receiving ketchup if you order a hamburger, the probability of receiving ketchup if you didn't order a hamburger, or if you didn't know the casual order is probably so. Based on how restaurants work, you could also calculate the probability someone ordered a hamburger if they received ketchup, and so on. Yes, as a toy example, the numbers are so low that there will be a high risk of statistical anomalies. So these probabilities would be a very low reliability. Normally, you'd have numbers in these boxes in the thousands or millions. But all Levitin is doing here is teaching the tool, using easier numbers to visualize and work with. He's not arguing that if this were real life, these probabilities would be usable. They wouldn't be because they are based on too little data, although there is a way to use them reliably by constructing an appropriate margin of error. But that's an entirely different tool and much more complicated and not one he is teaching here. I struggled with another thing in Levitin's book and wrote it here. Page 99 says a random opinion poll is an example of using frequentist probability. The poll can be conducted over a period of time and still be valid, provided that some big event that might change their minds didn't occur in between. However, it seems that there are many other factors besides time that can affect frequentist probability data. For example, I recall a poll I cited when you were a guest on my show previously. You pointed out correctly that the poll I cited was conducted primarily in neighborhoods which were much more likely to get the desired result. In this case, first-generation immigrants from Islamic countries were disproportionately favored over second, third, and fourth-generation immigrants in order to skew the immigrant Islamic extremism as more commonplace than it actually is. Dr. Carrier's response: correct, but Levitin is talking about legitimately randomized polls. A poll that does not randomize, for example, cherry picks neighborhoods to poll non-randomly, would never pass peer review because it is a violation of the scientific method, which evokes the question why someone would do that. There are exceptions, but they are allowed only when admitted and unavoidable, and the conclusions qualified accordingly. For example, an otherwise legitimately randomized poll of a certain neighborhood only gets you results that neighborhood, not the population of a city or country, and a study would be required to say that. Lying with statistics is when you then claim your results reflect the whole city or the country. Thus, the only confounding factor left in a legitimate poll is time, because a pollster is supposed to have already properly randomized by space and other confounding factors. But a pollster can take their time as long as confounding factors by time are unlikely or not observed. For example, there is a private 10-year randomized survey of religious belief in the U.S. that is highly reliable because it randomizes a sample over 100,000 Americans. But the poll takes a whole year to complete, and major shifts in religious affiliation occur over a short period of time, such as would be any larger than the poll's already accepted margin of error, are extremely unlikely and would likely be observed had they occurred. And again, it's important that a study state correctly what it is measuring and that people using that study don't treat it as having shown more than it has. Those are two different issues than what Levitin is talking about here. Thus, for example, on the dimension of generation, a poll that does not measure that, it does not ask what generation an Islamic respondent is of, so the data isn't recorded, will simply not tell you if the polled views are the same across generations. So it would be a violation of scientific method to claim that they are. This can be an extremely confounding factor because an abnormally high percentage of outlier population are often first-gen immigrants. For example, people will misuse polls showing Asians better at scholastics and having higher IQs than other races in the US as proving Asians as a race are smarter, but this is a confoundment. In fact, over 60% of Asians in the US are first-generation immigrants who have been selected by our immigration process for education and wealth, and thus de facto intelligence. In other words, we are choosing smarter Asians and not letting the rest in. So the effect is a product of our visa system, not of race. Polling Asians globally shows no race-based distinction in these variables at all. Likewise, since we know a similar percentage of Muslims in any country are a rising minority in first-generation immigrants, any poll of Muslim beliefs won't be as informative of where Muslims land second and third and later generations. But that's actually the thing we want to know. So polls that don't track this are largely useless. By contrast, a far smaller percentage of Christians in the U.S. are first-generation immigrants, so that their opinions differ considerably from their kids born here and their kids won't much affect polled results that lump all Christians in together, since most by far who polled are not first-generation immigrants. This is an important critical thinking skill to detect what confounding factors are rather obvious and rather catastrophic to the goals of a poll, yet that poll failed to measure. This is one of the most common ways polls studied end up garbage. Even under peer review, though more often than not, those studies show the failure of peer review to detect these things can rise in some fields as high as 2 in 3. More typical rates of failure are around 1 in 3, though that is still too high to trust single studies. The peer review only forced a study author to admit what confounding factors they didn't measure and not to misrepresent what the data collected can actually tell us, which is inadequate when the study is then being used by, say, media or a think tank or a random person on the internet who isn't bound by that professional ethic by any peer review committee, and they choose to misstate what the study actually shows. Hence the need for critical thinking. Most important at the stage at which studies are reported on or used in arguments, but also still important even at the stage of evaluating the study itself. Since peer review is not that reliable in the sciences anymore, and studies can skate by peer review with clever wording designed to hide the study's actual limitations from amateurs by meeting the technical requirements of accuracy while still appearing to say something they aren't. There is also a problem of weighting techniques, which are used to compensate for inadequately randomized results, often in national phone polls because almost no one has or answers a landline anymore, a subject that is highly technically complex and usually can only be evaluated by experts, which is one reason it can be handy to find an actual expert critique of a study that used weighting improperly. A recently famous example is how a single black respondent completely skewed polls that were weighting improperly. Ultimately, you are thinking in the right direction, though. There are many ways a poll can be misleading or confounded, and we won't always be told what those were. So being able to think through what they might be and how big of an effect they might have is crucial to receiving and using statistics critically. The issue of opinion polling populations who are disproportionately recent immigrants is a good example, but there are many others. And here is where I try to make a witty comment on something I read, and turns out I was completely wrong. I said, side note, the book says a 30% chance of rain means the forecaster is 30% sure it will rain tomorrow. I say this is inaccurate. When I what I thought was when meteorologists say 30% chance of rain, they really mean they are fairly certain that at least 30% of the local area will experience rain tomorrow, which is different. The forecasts are based on location, not a holistic prediction. Dr. Carrier's response is thus: these amount to the same thing if you think about it. If 30% of the squares on a board are black, and I don't know which square you are in, how sure am I that you are in a black square? This is explained by this article at AccuWeather. The quote is, your probability of precipitation is the likelihood that you will receive measurable precipitation during the forecast time frame, i.e. you and not say the whole LA County. Semantically, they are saying we are 30% sure any given inhabitant of LA will experience rain, which can also be wrong, but that's a separate issue. They are doing their best to guess based on past cases and scientific models. Next, we have a lengthy reading assignment based on breast cancer statistics. I said, the math in the breast cancer chart on pages 112 through 115 blew my mind at first. I just couldn't grasp why the total population of 10,000 and the rate of breast cancer, 0.8%, was being factored into the equation. I wrote values of 90, 10, 93, and 7 in the empty boxes, respectively, instead of 72, 8, 694, and 9,226. It totally makes sense now, but there is still no way at this point that I would be able to set a chart like this up and carry out a similar analysis. And to be honest, I don't know if I could do it now, even after the course, but I'm closer now than I was before. Richard responds, you could once you're given the data. Since it's binary, you just have to include the yes and the no for both categories on each side of the table. What a yes and a no means, and must always sum to 100% of the sample. Since there is no middle third category, everything is either a yes or a no. You can then use the sums to build ratios between different variables. This is what Levitin is trying to show you using the hamburgers and ketchup toy example. It's exactly the same thing going on here. It's just more silly than an actual mammogram survey. But that's the point, using smaller numbers and easier ideas about what is being measured so you can figure out the tool. So that when you get huge numbers and more complicated ideas on the table, you at least get the tool. You could do this with any study that actually tells you the data, usually indicated after an N. For example, N equals 123 means 123 people or 123 things counted. That would be the number that goes in the box. Sadly, too many studies now are allowed to be published without telling you any of the N data, so you can't run checks on it this way. I think that should be disallowed. Peer review should universally compel that this information is always included. For example, if you are told 123 atheists were randomly found and polled, and 5 had depression, and 890 Christians were polled, and 39 had depression, you can build out this table. Then you can get the sums. 123 plus 890 equals 1,013 people were polled, of which 5 plus 39, 44 had depression. You can also get the total polled by adding all 4 boxes and coming up with 1,013, because that accounts for every person polled. Conversely, your table is invalid if anyone polled is not counted anywhere on it. Non-atheists, which in this example are all polled as Christians, sum up to 890 because 39 with depression plus the 851 without accounts for all of them, 890. Then with these sums, you can do the ratios. Just according to the table, we aren't assessing margins of error or anything yet. So what is the raw frequency of being depressed if you're an atheist? Well, you can now figure that. It's the number of depressed atheists, 5, divided by the total number of atheists, 123, which equals 4%. For the Christians, it's 39 divided by 890, or 4.4%. Now you can see the difference is small, probably too small to be significant. Random variations in the sample could account for it. These numbers are all made up. These are not the real results of any study, but just to illustrate what you can do with these tables once you build them.